The presentation today is being brought to you by the Oraculos School of Astrology. And once again, you can find out everything you need to know about us by visiting our website at www.oraculosastrology.com. The title of this talk is The Qabalistic Tarot, the Astrologer's Field Guide to the Cosmos. Now, a big part of this presentation today is to introduce you to not just the Qabalistic Tarot, but also to introduce you to our Qabalistic Tarot Professional Certification Program, which is a one-year training that we offer at OSA, and it begins the 18th of March, 2022. So if you love what you see here today, please feel free to go on over to our website and sign up for our early bird special, because we definitely have that going on, and we would definitely love to have you become a part of our Oraculos family. We're starting with a quote by Frater Ahad, who in his book, The Bride's Reception, which is a book on the Hermetic Kabbalah, starts by saying, "That I do not mention these by name is not through lack of courtesy, but rather that I feel it desirable to confuse the issue as little as possible." So he's referring to authors who have gone before, or teachers who have gone before in terms of this particular system of divination. In other words, although the Holy Kabbalah must, of course, have a history, just for once, I intend to take the liberty of leaving aside the historical background, and with it the squabbles over its origin, as to whether it was in the beginning transmitted by God to the angels and in turn to men, or whether it arose from obscurity within the last 1800 years, considering rather its present use. And I really love that, because within his words, he captures a utilitarian spirit of early turn of the century mysticism, insofar as divination, Kabbalistic tarot, and Hermeticism are concerned. That for once, let's not talk about whether or not the Kabbalah was created by holy men sitting down in caves in Safed, or whether or not it was transmitted from God to the angels, from the angels to Adam, and then from Adam all the way down to Abraham and ultimately to us. But what is the current utility that we can get from the Kabbalistic Tarot? What is the utility that we can get from divination as a practice? And how can we use that to further enrich our lives? So the question is, what is divination? Divination is the art and science of direct communication with the divine intelligence or the higher self through an established symbolic language. And what this definition does is it packs in a lot of information regarding this concept of divination. First of all, if I could do this again, I would rather put divination is the science and the art, because ultimately, whenever we learn a system or a language of communicating with the divine, we're fundamentally having to learn the rigorous scaffolding of that system. Everything has a scaffolding, everything has a system, everything has foundations that you have to learn in order for you to speak with some level of fluency. If we want to speak in Spanish, for example, there's a particular way of learning Spanish. Well, there are many ways of learning Spanish, but ultimately, no matter which path you take, you should learn something about the conjugation of verbs. You should learn something about subject-verb agreement or noun-verb agreement, and also how to formulate sentences so that you can express yourself eloquently within that language. And the same thing applies within divination. Now, what's interesting about this is that we all know that ultimately, when we practice divination, it also unlocks greater valleys or greater frontiers of intuitive understanding within ourselves. That through the study of divination, we come into a deeper understanding of something that we cannot learn from books, something that we cannot learn just from a technical perspective. And that is when our mechanical practice of divination becomes an art. When the divination itself, the divinatory moment itself, unleashes something else within the practitioner that is fundamentally intuitive, fundamentally beyond any rote learning we can do, and ultimately connecting us to the heart of the divine itself. However, we can't jump there unless we've first understood that language fully and established a relationship or established an agreement between ourselves and the divine that says, hey, I will learn this language for the process of us speaking with greater fluency between each other. Because if we establish that relationship or that agreement with the divine, then by whatever miraculous, magical process, the divine also steps forward into that agreement with us and begins to communicate with us via that modality. So if it is astrology that you're studying, the divine will speak to you through your astrology practice. If it's Hermetic Kabbalah that you're studying, through the tarot specifically, the divine will speak to you through the tarot. If it's runes, if it's Yijing, if it's chiromancy, we set up a language system so that we can speak with the divine, so that our ultimate understanding goes beyond what we can learn from a book. And that is fundamentally the heart of divination, that we can speak with the divine intelligence or communicate with our own higher self, whether you see yourself communicating with some gods beyond yourself, or whether you see yourself communicating with some divine part of yourself. The act of divination is meant to help you establish that link through an established symbolic language. And we'll speak about what some of those established symbolic languages are. In every branch of divination, there are three components: the querent, the person asking the question; the quesited, the thing asked about; and the diviner or the artist, the person skilled at providing an interpretation based on the oracular method being employed. Now, when it comes to things like natal astrology specifically, that for the most part, a lot of us don't really view as being a divinatory practice. While astrology does have a divinatory branch within horary astrology, where a question is asked and a chart is casted for the moment of that question, we don't necessarily consider natal astrology to be divinatory in that same sense. However, I would argue that even our natal astrological practice is also divinatory, because within every natal chart, there are certain questions being asked, and those questions are universal questions. For example, who am I? What is my purpose here within this lifetime? What is my destiny in relationship to finances? What is my destiny in relationship to where I fall within the context of my family unit? What is my destiny in relationship to my children? What is my destiny in relationship to marriage? So insofar as practices such as natal astrology or even chiromancy have this ability to answer these inbuilt universal questions, I believe that even those are practices of divination. In terms of the more specific questions, such as, will I get married this year? Will I make money from this business venture this year? There are other systems of divination that are probably better suited to answering these more temporal questions, these questions rooted in this present moment, as opposed to those larger universal questions. But fundamentally at the heart of divination is this concept of the question, that there's either an implied question in what is occurring between you and the client, or that there is a stated question that the client is specifically asking. Core to the concept of divination is that there is a question that serves as the cosmic trigger or the catalyst for the answer that arises through whatever system of divination we may be employing. So this brings up a very important point, specifically regarding more dynamic systems of divination, such as the tarot, the runes, the Yijing, tasseography, which is the reading of tea leaves, geomancy, which is the divination of the earth, that the question serves as a trigger or a catalyst that unlocks or begins or initiates a process of divine answering within the cosmos that allows for that answer to be revealed. And that if there is no question for those more dynamic systems of divination, then there really is no divination, because core to divination is that there is a question. Now, within the 21st century, we've gotten into the habit of going to our tarot reader who lives in our same apartment complex and going for a general reading, or we've gotten into the habit of going to our sister's cousin who does a little bit of I Ching on the side and going to her for a general I Ching checkup or a general I Ching tune-up. But if we place ourselves back in the ancient world, when the person within the community that held the ability to do these things was someone who was very far away, someone who you couldn't easily reach, someone who you couldn't just knock on the door across the hall from you and get a reading from them, then you realize that for the ancients, this concept of the general reading didn't exist. If you wanted to go and get a reading from the Oracle of Delphi, you had to leave your home, cross the hedge, go through the forbidden forest for 3 days walking, probably starve yourself, scrape your knees, fall down, be chased by wolves, reach a lake, give someone in the barge, the boat at the lake, a golden coin, where they will take you across the shivering cold to the mountain where the oracle is, climb up the mountain. Now you're 4 days hungry, no food, no water, no anything. And still, once you reach the foot of her temple, be met by her guards and her hounds. And only after passing through all of this would you be able to approach that oracle, also with the sacrifice in hand and with your question in hand. And while that might be a dramatic romanticization of something that occurred at a time when none of us were around to know the truth of that or not, I think within that model or within that framework, we see that by the time as you arrived to the temple of the oracle, you didn't arrive there with a general question in heart. You didn't arrive there with, oh, let me just get a cosmic tune-up, let me just do a check-in. Because you wouldn't put yourself through that perilous process just to get a cosmic tune-up or just to get a check-in. You arrived there, and the reason why that journey was so treacherous is because that journey was meant to weed out the faint of heart. The people who did not have the stamina or the endurance or the necessity to even be asking that question in the first place. Because many of the questions that we are faced with as diviners are questions that are fundamentally unnecessary. And if it was a more treacherous path for clients to receive readings, then one would imagine that a question would crystallize within the heart of that client so clearly to the point where when that client came to you, they had nothing but the clarity of that single question within themselves. Guido Bonatti, writing in his book Liber Astrologiae, tells us that if a person is coming to you for a horary question, that person should dwell on that question within their hearts and their minds for 3 days and 3 nights. Nowadays, any question, is this person whose thigh I just brushed my soulmate? Is this person whose trolley I just bumped my soulmate? Is this person who I just met yesterday my soulmate? We oftentimes find as diviners that a lot of the questions people ask are soulmate questions. Is this person the love of my life and I only just met this person 2 seconds ago? And those questions carry a flippant nature about them that don't really match this burning desire that we are speaking about here within the context of divination. When I came into divination practice, I did so as a child. And so I saw myself grow as a child between asking very flippant, very unnecessary questions of my craft. Is this person the love of my life? Where is this person right now? Should I go on this bus ride for 2 hours to see this person? Is this person going to take the 2-hour bus ride to come and see me? What should I eat for dinner? What should I cook this person for dinner? I saw myself engaged in a level of flippant participation with my divination practice. And then I saw the universe sending me people who had those same sorts of concerns. I had a client once who would call me every single time she walked 2 inches within the range of someone who she found to be attractive, which was quite often. And I found myself getting frustrated at her. I found myself wanting to turn my phone off for her because it was just too much. But I saw within her a mirror of myself, And I realized that the sort of questions she was coming with reflected the sort of questions I was asking. And it was a wonderful moment within my own life to grow and to evolve and to mature, because fundamentally, as we engage with divination, we should know that we're engaging in something that isn't just something you do at someone's birthday party, but it is actually a truly divine moment that we're participating in. And our goal or our placement within the world is no less important than the placement of the oracle at Delphi thousands of years ago. Some of the systems of divination are the Yi Ching, and the Yi Ching is pronounced Yi Ching. It's not the I Ching. Many people say I Ching, which is our Western proclivity to call things incorrectly, but it is the Yi Ching. Tarot, runes, geomancy, which is divination by earth, pyromancy, divination by fire, hydromancy, divination by water, Ifa, which is an ancient African system of divination, tasseography, tasseomancy, the reading of tea leaves, bibliomancy, divination by knowledge or books. You have a question and you open the book and then you point your finger on the page in that book, and then where you pointed your finger is where the answer is supposed to be. Scrying, whether by crystals or whether by mirrors. Chiromancy, divination by palms, viz. Palmistry or hand analysis, which Dylan Warren Davis is going to speak to us about later. Astrology, runes or runamal, casting lots, which is also called sortilege, the casting of bones, dice, rune stones. Phrenology, interpretation of the landmarks on the human skull. Arithmancy, divination by numbers or numerology. And the list actually does go on and on. So as you can see, there are many systems of divination that you can plug yourself into, systems that completely jive with who you specifically are. And I encourage you all, if you haven't yet found the system of divination that makes sense to you, to either choose one from this list. You can choose one from Oraculos, whether you choose to study horary astrology or chiromancy or geomancy or tarot or runes or any of the things we offer here, and give yourself the opportunity to establish a system of divine communication. Because when you do that, you allow yourself to step forward into a more fulfilling, much larger version of life than probably the life that you would lead if you had no regular, consistent means of communicating with the divine. It's truly an extraordinary practice. There are two types of questions. I found this person in the Bahamas. He is a model who agreed to be a part of the making of this live presentation. So we have transient questions, and these are questions rooted in the here and now. Should I go to Portland next week? Should I take that job? Will I make money on this new business venture? Will I get married this year? Is this person my soulmate? Is this the end of my relationship? And transient questions are better suited to horary astrology or the divinational branch of astrology, tarot, Yi Ching, sortilege, the casting of lots, tasseography, runes, etc. Then there are the lifetime questions, which we at Oraculos call the evers and the nevers. And these are questions rooted in the full unfolding of the life of the querent. These questions tend to be heavier than transient questions, and their impact is more far-reaching. What's my purpose? Will I ever get married? And those questions are better suited for things such as natal astrology, which is the interpretation of the birth chart that you were born under. Chiromancy, which is hand analysis or palmistry, and Dylan Warren Davis is going to be talking to us more about that, as well as phrenology, which is the interpretation of the contours of the human skull. As there are two types of questions, there are also two types of divination. There is dynamic divination, a method of divination where the instrument being utilized has an inherent chaos and the ability to be randomized in rapid succession. Now, for those of you who haven't heard my chaos talk at Oraculos, it's a wonderful talk because chaos isn't actually just a state of being, but chaos is the primordial progenitrix of the ancient gods within the Greek pantheon. And obviously, throughout thousands of years of patriarchy, chaos, the goddess, has been villainized. And now we think about chaos as just the random destruction of the world, whereas chaos is ultimately this universal sea of change from which a world and from which a universe was born. So a dynamic divination is a method of divination, whereas there is an inherent chaos and the ability for it to be randomized in rapid succession. In dynamic divination, the ego process is more easily suspended than in more static forms of divination. And the chief example of this would be the Qabalistic Tarot within my particular life, which isn't the only system of divination I use, but it is the system of divination I use most frequently. And the Qabalistic Tarot, through the shuffling of the 78 cards or keys of the tarot deck, you suspend your ego. You put your ego on the shelf and you actively step into the realms of chaotic unknown. And you say to the divine that you're willing to suspend the part of yourself that decides. You're willing to suspend the part of yourself that can enforce its will upon the world. And through that suspension of that ego process, you're willing to be guided to a grand canyon of wisdom that you, of your own potential, weren't able to take yourself to. And that's why I think dynamic divination is so powerful. And that's why I also think that it's such a humbling thing to be a part of, because when you step forward into the chaotic waters of dynamic divination, whether you do that through the I Ching or whether you do that through the Qabalistic Tarot or through any method of dynamic divination, you're suspending that part of you that knows. You're suspending that part of you that decides and saying, I will give up to the universe what belongs to the universe, and I will allow myself to be guided because I have come to a place where I cannot guide myself. Then more static forms of divination would be methods whereby the instrument being utilized has an inherent order and cannot quickly be randomized in rapid succession. So there is no rapid shuffling of the lines of the palms of your hands. There is no shuffling at all of your natal chart. And we would hope that you do not engage in activities in your life where there would be rapid shufflings of the hills and valleys of your skull. Because if you do engage in those activities, please stick around at the end so that we can get you whatever help you need to step away from such a dangerous act. So there is no random shuffling of these things, and therefore there is an inherent order. But even within that inherent order, like Dylan Warren Davis said earlier, there is a concatenation or a multitude of ways a hand can show up. There's a multitude of ways a birth chart can show up. So even though an order exists to these practices of static divination, the ways in which they can show up are no less diverse than the ways in which dynamic divination operates. Eliphas Levi, in his book, The Doctrine and Ritual of Transcendental Magic, says that divination is therefore an intuition, and the key of this intuition is the universal and magical doctrine of analogies. By means of these analogies, the magus interprets visions. The analogies in the reflections of the astral light are as exact as the shades of color in the solar spectrum and can be calculated and explained with great accuracy. And this concept of the astral light, which those of you who've studied Kabbalah with me at all, is the prototype that is just behind our materiality. So the ancients referred to this as subspecie interioritatis. And subspecie interioritatis means that which dwells within the heart of interiority. So within the heart of our physical interiority, there is another world, a prototypical world that is purely made of the prototypical energetic or astral substances that later on become condensed into the physical material universe around us. And the practices of divination that we practice are things that have the ability to draw from that astral world into a concrete form, whether it's through the flipping of tarot cards or whether it's through the interpretation of the lines on the palms of our hands. There's this drawing from that ether light, this drawing from that astral light into materiality, an answer, either for the question being asked or either for the constitution of our entire life. that we draw constantly from that astral light, the imprint of ourselves that exists within the astral light. And through that process, we fundamentally have something to interpret, whether it's the tarot, whether it's the lines in the palm of our hand, whether it is our natal chart. We have something to interpret because that thing first existed in energetic form within the veil of our material world, which I find quite fascinating, truthfully. Robert Wang, in his book, The Qabalistic Tarot, says it may come as a surprise to some to learn that the primary reason for divination in the great work is not to learn the future. Rather, it is for the development of psychic faculties. The more one uses the tarot cards, and I dare say the more one uses the tarot or any system of divination, dynamic or static, to find the answers to given questions, the more that person taps into unseen currents. And that's fundamentally what we all want to do. We want to step into a field or a practice that has the ability to develop us far more than just the physical constitution of ourselves and our physical understanding of the world. We want to step into things that have the ability to expand our understanding of that which lies behind the veil of our interiority. So the whole what is divination talk was the Trojan horse to get us to what is the Kabbalistic Tarot, and I'll be giving a demonstration of the Kabbalistic Tarot later on this evening, so please stick around for that as well. The tarot is a pictorial representation of the titanic forces of nature in dynamic action and how they impact our lives. The tarot is a pictorial representation of the titanic forces of nature, the planets, their relationships between each other, the elements, their relationships between each other, the signs of the zodiac, their relationships between each other, even at the substratum, the four qualities of hot, cold, wet, and dry, their relationships between each other, in dynamic action and how they impact our lives. For the mystic, creation was never a moment that happened. But creation is a constant process that is still in the process of unfolding. So within the process of this study of divination, and more so specifically here within the context of the Kabbalistic Tarot, what we see when we shuffle a deck of tarot cards is the processes of nature, or the processes that have fundamentally formed a universe being brought into dynamic action and being asked a question pertinent to our personal experience on this planet. Now, that for me gives me a great deal of pause, and I'm struck by a deep spirit of reverence when I think about that, because what this acknowledges is that the same forces that have created a universe are the same forces that are creating and molding the shape of my life. And if I can step into that stream where those forces actually take place, if I can look like Ezekiel into the void and see wheels within wheels, if I can look like Jacob into heaven and see the stellar staircase of heaven and the hosts of heaven moving back and forward and creating a universe around me, then I can also see how those forces specifically and dynamically impact and create the shape of the experiences that I'm going through. And I think that what that does is it also gives us some level of something greater within ourselves about the experiences that we go through. As human beings, when we go through the trials and the tribulations of life, we sometimes forget our birthplace within divinity. And we sometimes forget that the same forces that have created the universe are those same forces that have shaped every experience that we go through. Because all of us have a story to tell, and all of the individual stories that we tell are connected to a much larger substratum of the stories of everything and every process that's existed within the universe. The death of my specific grandfather is tied in on a microcosmic level to the death of every star that has ever died, or the death of every other person within this universe that's ever died, or the death of every tree or creature at all. Because death as a process is a process that occurs throughout all levels of the universe. My specific heartbreak or my specific breakup because this relationship hasn't worked out the way that I've intended it to work out is tied in with every other heartbreak, with every other relationship that has ever been had since the dawn of time. Whether those relationships occur macrocosmically in terms of the tragic story of the love of Venus and Mars, and how they retell that tragic story in the context of their oppositions from an astrological perspective, or whether my relationship has taken on something far more sinister or something far more underworld, like the story of Persephone being abducted by Pluto and being dragged to the underworld to become his wife and his queen, which is a story that we oftentimes find recapitulated from an astrological perspective in terms of the relationship of Venus and the actual planet Pluto, whether they are connected by conjunction or by opposition or some other aspectual relationship. So the point is that everything that we have ever experienced has already been experienced. And the tarot, because it represents these titanic forces of nature, it has the ability to serve as a proxy and serve as a representative of all of those experiences. Therefore, at one level, we see the deep personal nature of our own suffering, but then we see that our suffering is the same suffering that everyone has ever suffered, and that through our joys and through our sorrows, we are connected to everyone. And if that's the case, acts of divination, whether we're talking about tarot or whether we're talking about something more static, acts of divination allow us to plug ourselves into a much larger story that's being told through us. The heartbreak that's being told through you is the story of heartbreak generally. And even though it may be individualized and in radiant expression within your particular life, it carries the seed of every heartbreak. The triumph that is being experienced by you is the same triumph that was experienced by Jason and the Argonauts when he reached and captured the Golden Fleece. And so it allows us to plug ourselves into a greater system of mythic storytelling. And because divination has that capacity, it also has the ability to lift us up from the heaviness and the burden of our personal suffering, because it shows us that this suffering that we're experiencing has a place and it has a role, not just within the larger untelling of our personal lives, but within the larger untelling of a greater universal story of the lives of everyone and everything that's ever existed. Paul Foster Case, in his book, The Tarot, A Key to the Wisdom of the Ages, tells us that Levy's opinion of the tarot was very high. He said, as an erudite Kabbalistic book, all combinations of which reveal the harmonies pre-existing between signs, letters, and numbers, the practical value of the tarot is truly and above all marvelous. A prisoner devoid of books, had he only a tarot of which he knew how to make use, could in a few years acquire a universal science and converse with an unequaled doctrine and inexhaustible eloquence. So what this means is that the tarot, because of the way in which it represents in pictorial form all of the very forces that have formed our universe, if you only had the tarot with you on a stranded island and you knew of which he knew how to make use, you could develop a treasure house of wisdom within yourself, and you could ultimately develop the wisdom of the ages. These are people, these teachers, Paul Foster Case, Eliphas Levi, are no light students of mysticism. These were people who are the very backbone upon which a lot of the Western mystery tradition were built. And they held the tarot not just as something that you do at your friend's birthday party It's something that they held as being able to contain within itself all the wisdom that we may ever seek to know as a human being or as a spiritual being within a human body. And that is truly profound. Eliphas Levi says, the tarot, that miraculous work which inspires all the sacred books of antiquity, is the most perfect instrument of divination by reason of the analogical precision of its figures and numbers. It can be employed with complete confidence. Its oracles are always rigorously true, at least in a certain sense, and even when it predicts nothing, it reveals secret things and gives the most wise counsel to its querents. I was giving a reading to a lady a couple days ago who I had never met before. She came to a workshop I was doing a few weeks back, but I knew nothing about this lady at all. And we did a Qabalistic Tarot reading. And at the end of it, she said, yeah, but all of those things you just told me, I already know. All of those things you just told me, I've been working and dealing with those things for years. I already know those things about myself, but I don't really see the answer to the question that I asked. And that reminded me of this last section here, that even when it predicts nothing, it reveals secret things and gives the most wise counsel to its querents. I never knew any of those things about her. I never knew the contours of her personal life, what she had done, where she had been, the challenges and the triumphs that she had had. And I find that quite astounding, that when people come to an astrologer or a chiromancer or a Qabalistic Tarot Consultant or anyone, and at the end of their reading, they say, but I already knew those things, with the expectation of more, it doesn't strike them how uncanny it is that someone who doesn't know them at all could even have access to that information. Paul Foster Case goes on to tell us that the tarot is a pictorial textbook of ageless wisdom. And we're going to take a look as to why that is in our next slides. The tarot keys are composed of pictorial and geometrical symbols. These symbols are the natural language of the subconscious mind. So here we find him nodding his head at some of the work of Carl Jung, speaking about archetypes as the symbols which are the natural language of the subconscious mind, which are the symbols that the tarot holds within itself. A language older than any human tongue, a language from which all modes of human speech have been derived. Fundamentally, we think in pictures, not in words. And this pictorial language, common to the whole human race, is the means whereby the subconscious mind may communicate to us the highest knowledge reflected from the superconscious level of the true self. He's speaking about the tarot deck. And he's not speaking about the Buffy the Vampire Slayer tarot deck. He's not speaking about the Pokemon tarot deck. He's not speaking about any of these weird and exotic tarot decks that get made, one deck gets made every other day by people who have some whiff of intuition within themselves. He's speaking about a classical approach to the tarot that is fundamentally based on this ancient wisdom, where every line and every stroke that went into the creation of that deck has an individual symbolic meaning. What makes the Qabalistic Tarot so potent? Aleister Crowley, and his surname is most assuredly Crowley, it's not Crowley. He even made a poem about it that said, my name is Aleister Crowley because something, I'm holy. My enemies call me Crowley because they think of me foully. So his name isn't Aleister Crowley, his name is Aleister Crowley. In his book, The Book of Thoth, he says, the tarot is a pictorial representation of the forces of nature as conceived by the ancients according to a conventional symbolism. At first sight, one would suppose this arrangement to be arbitrary, but it is not. It is necessitated by the structure of the universe, and in particular, the solar system as symbolized by the Holy Kabbalah. Every card within the 78 cards of the tarot deck has some greater relevance in terms of the structure of the entire cosmos as it is conceived within the Holy Kabbalah. The divisions of the Kabbalistic Tarot. The tarot is divided primarily into two parts: the major arcana, consisting of 22 keys or cards; the minor arcana, consisting of 56 keys or cards. Now, what is this word arcana? Arcana comes from the root arcanum, and as we can see, it actually has a long diacritical marking, which means that it should be pronounced arcanum, and therefore it should be arcana, but old habits die hard. So arcana or arcana comes from the root arcanum, which means mysterious or specialized knowledge, language, or information accessible or possessed only by the initiate, usually used in plural, in other words, arcana. And this last line, which does not come from the Dictionary of Mysticism, this comes from Merriam-Webster herself, God bless her heart. This last line, that it is information accessible or possessed only by the initiate, is something that is embedded within the major and minor arcana. And what that is that you have to be initiated into that wisdom. We can't just pick up a deck of tarot cards and read it intuitively. In the same way as you can't just pick up the palm of someone's hand and read it intuitively. And one of the great misfortunes of the 21st century is that there is this approach to spiritual counseling that is devoid of the rigor of spiritual study. And in order for you to actively tap into the wellspring of wisdom that is founded on something greater than your personal intuition, but that's founded on generations of masters who have gone before both you and I through their own pursuits and their own studies and their own contemplations, the only way you can tap into that information and access that information is if you become initiated into that secret doctrine. So even the name Arcana suggests that there is a secret doctrine. And if you look at a card on the surface and posit a meaning based on what that card represents, oh, the Three of Cups, there are three people laughing in that card, therefore I should go to this party this weekend, then you would have locked your own self out of the kingdom of heaven. There's a quote that those who wish to get good at mathematics can do so through studying a book. But if you wish to understand the divine wisdom, you cannot storm the gates of heaven. And this storming of the gates of heaven comes through this immature approach to spiritual subjects where I can just pick it up today and I'll be a master tomorrow. Or I can just pick it up today and I'll be the greatest thing in the world. I will put on my YouTube channel, I'll do my blog, I'll do my Facebook post, even though I have done no study yet. That studying has to be there. That studying has to come first. Because like I said earlier, the role of the diviner within the 21st century is no less sacred than the role of the oracle at Delphi. We are all the oracle at Delphi. And in the same way as we continue to speak about her to this day, because of the mammoth relationship she had to that moment of time within which she existed, all of us who are doing this work should be spoken of in the same manner when we are no more, because all of us stand to have that level of divine communication as she did. Divisions of the Qabalistic Tarot. The major arcana consists of 22 keys or cards, and those 22 keys refer to the three elements or the alchemical principles. And the three elements from a Kabbalistic perspective are air, water, and fire, because fundamental to the meaning of an element is that which has a living spirit within itself. And the ancients, building their natural philosophy, saw water having a natural relationship to instability within itself through its constantly unfixed nature. Fire having a relationship to instability, having a relationship to primordial chaos as a result of its foundational, always changing nature. Air having a relationship to chaos, and therefore still holding something of that primordial life spark because of its relationship to chaos through its fundamental living and constantly moving nature. The ancients did not know how to categorize Earth from the perspective of Earth being an element. Even if we look at a Platonic model of the universe, we have fire being the uppermost element. We have air being between the fire and that which is below. We have water being on the surface of the earth. And we have earth being the final element within that model, because all of the other elements that go before it fundamentally have their play in life through the element of earth. We understand all the other elements through their material nature, which is their earthy body. But we don't actually understand the elements on their own terms. We don't actually understand the elements on their own astral terms. Because we are within a physical body, we understand things physically. We understand the nature of fire because of how fire is physically. But none of us actually understands fire from a truly deeply spiritual perspective, from that substratum of the astral light, because even the fire that we see is fire made physical within the world, but it is not the true fire. Even water that we see is water made physical within the material world, but it is not the true substratum of what the element of water actually is. So the ancients saw these elements as having their play on the earth, but they didn't necessarily see the earth itself as being an element or having that same living nature as was mentioned previously in terms of the other elements. That is the three elements. The three elements correspond with the three alchemical principles of sulfur, mercury, and salt. And sulfur, mercury, and salt are corresponding with the three gunas of the Vedic tradition, which would be rajas, which would be sulfur, which corresponds with fire, sattva, which would be mercury, which corresponds with the air, and then tamas, which corresponds with the water element, which is corresponding with salt. So that for the ancients was their three constituent principles that created their universe. And earth is seen as hanging as a pendant from the other elements, insofar as earth is the final element that we know of. The 7 planets of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, and then the 12 signs of the zodiac of Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. Please don't ask me to say it backwards because I am not so gifted. Then the minor arcana, consisting of 56 keys or cards, which will be the 16 court cards, the 36 numbered cards, and ultimately the 4 aces. And the aces are separated from the numbered cards because the aces are very, very special. And you'll find out later on why they are so special. I mean, ultimately, the number 1 is special. So you could leave that the aces are special because they represent the number 1. The 56 minor arcana cards are further divided into 40 numbered cards, 10 cards for each of the elements, fire being the wands, water being the cups, air being the swords, and earth being the pentacles or the coins. And then the 56 minor arcana cards are further divided into 16 court cards, 4 given to each of the elements. So you get 4 times 4 equals 16. They represent sub-elements. Therefore, all the kings would represent fire, all the queens would represent water, all the knights would represent air, and all the pages or the princesses, as they should be rightfully called, would represent earth, no matter what suit they're in. So for example, the King of Wands is the fiery part of the fire element, whereas the Queen of Wands is the watery part of the fire element. The Knight of Wands is the airy part of the fire element. And the Page or the Princess of Wands is the earthy part of the fire element. And so on throughout all the court cards in their respective elements. So what we see here being built for us isn't just some royal family seated on a throne. we see each of the court cards representing different processes of distillation within the elements themselves. Therefore, the King of Wands would be the fieriest part of fire and therefore more representative of fire, whereas the Queen of Cups would be the wateriest part of water and therefore most representative of water. The Knight of Swords would be the airiest part of air and therefore most representative of the air element. And the Page or the Princesses of Pentacles or Coins would be the earthiest part of earth, therefore representing the truest version of the earth element. The structure of the Kabbalistic Tarot. The 22 major arcana keys or trumps are the foundational blocks upon which the universe is built. Why? I'll tell you why, but here they are, the 22 keys of the tarot, the 22 major arcana cards from 0, starting as the Fool, going all the way through 3 rows of 7 until we ultimately land on the World, where we see the symbol of 0 recapitulated around the dancer in the World card. The 22 major arcana keys or cards or trumps represent the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet or the Aleph Bet, which represent the 22 constituent elements of Kabbalistic or astrological cosmology. Frater Achad in the Bride's Reception says, the Hebrew alphabet is a natural basis of correspondence, for every letter is numerical as well as symbolical. Our basis, the Hebrew Aleph Bet, is admirably suited to this tarot philosophy, since its 22 letters are naturally divided into 3 divisions, which correspond with the 3 most important universal sets of ideas, viz., or in other words, the elements, the planets, and the signs of the zodiac. The divisions of the Aleph Bet are known as the 3 mother letters, the 7 double letters, so-called because they have a doubling of their sound, and the 12 single letters, so-called because they have a singling of their sound. So here we have the word Aleph Bet. This is Aleph, Aleph, Bet, Ivrit. Aleph Bet Ivrit is the Hebrew alphabet. And here we have the 22 letters of the Hebrew Aleph Bet, which both have a symbol associated with them, as well as a number associated with them. Therefore, Aleph would be an ancient Hebrew word for ox. It's not a modern word for ox, but it's an ancient Hebrew word for ox, and it's also associated with the number 1. Therefore, Aleph is carrying the signification of ox and what ox means, as well as the card that it comes on, which would be the Fool card, as well as the element that the Fool card represents, which would be air, as well as the path on the Tree of Life, where that Fool card comes, which would be the path between Keter and Chokmah on the Tree of Life. And so this one letter ends up holding a treasure house of symbolic meaning. And so we have Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yud, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samech, Ayin, Pei, Tzadi, Kuf, Reish, Shin, and Tav. And those 22 letters are represented by the 22 keys of the major arcana, which are these again. And here on this particular deck, which is the Bota deck or the Builders of the Adatum deck, which I use for teaching purposes, but not necessarily for giving readings, we have the Hebrew letter on all of the cards that they belong on. So the Fool receives Aleph, the Magician receives Bet, the High Priestess receives Gimel, the Empress receives Dalet, and so on throughout the 22 cards of the Kabbalistic Tarot and the major arcana specifically. In conclusion, Eliphas Levi tells us that there is also another book, but although it is popular in a sense and may be found everywhere, this is of all most occult and unknown, because it has the key of all the others. No one dreams of seeking it where it actually is, and elsewhere it is lost labor to look for it. This book, which may be older to that of Enoch, has never been translated, but is still preserved unmutilated in primeval characters on detached leaves, like the tablets of the ancients. He's referring to the Qabalistic Tarot. The fact has eluded notice. It is in truth a monumental and extraordinary work, strong and simple as the architecture of the pyramids, and consequently enduring like those. A book which is the sum of all the sciences, which can resolve all problems by its infinite combinations, which speaks by evoking thought, is the inspirer and the regulator of all possible conceptions, the masterpiece perhaps of the human mind, assuredly one of the finest things bequeathed to us by antiquity. It is a universal key. This understanding of the tarot is the understanding of the tarot that we operate under at Oraculos School of Astrology. And it's the understanding of the tarot that I teach from in terms of teaching the subject of the Qabalistic Tarot to our students. This reverence, this divine notion, this understanding that when you pick up a deck of tarot cards, you're picking up something that is older than the hills because you're picking up the story of all of our lives, is a work that I think we should hold with the utmost reverence. And I know that for myself, it took me a long time to come to that place in terms of my own tarot practice. And as I see people, and YouTube is now the best thing in the world, but it's also in a sense the root of all evil, because as I look around on YouTube and as I look around within the world in general, the way how such a sacred art and such a sacred science is being held, it doesn't actually do justice to that science itself. So a part of my goal is to bring back this reverential honoring of the process of divination, so that as we create more diviners from Oraculos to go out into the world to do this mammoth task of being consultants and of being oracles and of being intercessors, essentially, between the divine and people who are genuinely seeking answers, that we relight the spark of magic within the world, that we relight this spark of divine craving and of spiritual hunger within the world, and that we stand as being representatives for people of the magic that still exists. I do hope that you have enjoyed this presentation today. There are a few things that are going on at Oraculos that really allows us to continue to have these conversations and flesh these topics out. The final thing is that we have our Kabalistic Tarot Professional Certification Program, which is a one-year training program. So if anything about this presentation today has turned you on to these subjects, or it really makes you feel inspired to study with us in a deeper way, then please feel free to go and check out our website on our programs page. It begins on the 18th of March, 2022. We are still in the early bird special segment of it up until the end of January. So please do go check it out and sign up so that you can take advantage of all of the early bird goodness that we have over there as well.